Well, let me just say the kinds of things that should be done, in my opinion, are things like the Belt and Road Initiative of China,
Yep.
because the Chinese government recognized that for China's own well being, but also the well being of its neighbors, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth, and countries even farther afield, uh, all economies need modern infrastructure. And modern infrastructure means access to high quality electricity, especially zero carbon energy now, to fast rail, to fiber, 5G networks, and so forth. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is in its 10th year, uses especially finance from China, from the China Development Bank and other institutions, to help finance the spread of infrastructure across Eurasia and across the sea routes, also connecting Africa and South America and East Asia. So that's a very good example. It's pragmatic, it's investment oriented. It doesn't just talk the talk, it actually provides the financing and provides the technology. I wish the rich countries in the West were doing this. They are the former colonial powers. They behaved badly when they were the colonial powers, and they're not behaving very well as the post colonial
Right.
powers. They're not really stepping up to their responsibility.
Right. Because I was just in China like for 2 months, and I think it really strengthened the businesses of carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutralization by 2050. But I feel like the United States haven't done enough of promoting this ideology of carbon neutrality. So how, as citizens ourselves, can push for those changes?
It's interesting. In the United States, most people know that climate change is a very serious crisis, and we just had the devastating fires in Hawaii to show how tragic this climate change is. We're in the hottest period in not only recorded history, but in human history for the last 125,000 years. The month of July was probably the single hottest month ever that humanity has experienced. Certainly, that's true during the period of recorded temperatures. So we should be doing much more. And the American people know this. And certain things are happening, of course. There's investment in green energy in a lot of places. There's investment in the conversion of the auto industry to electric vehicles, which is part of the solution. At the national level, there was a piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very strange name for legislation, which is mainly centered on the energy transformation, and it gives tax breaks for green energy. But what it doesn't do is make a national plan. There
Right.
is no national plan.
Right.
It doesn't make a national plan because in American politics, the power of the fossil fuel lobby, big oil and big coal, is so strong that politicians don't tell the truth to their own constituents, and they act on behalf of their lobbies who pay for their campaigns rather than on behalf of the American people. In the United States Senate, in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the chairman, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is notorious for being the front for the big oil lobby. And he himself has family wealth tied up in two coal companies.
Right.
So I regard that as corruption. But in the American system, it's legal corruption, or seems to be legal, but it's corruption not nonetheless. If you're told that in a country that hasn't taken a clear plan for decarbonization has senior officials who own coal companies, you'd say, well, of course, that's just political corruption. But unfortunately, that's how the United States works. So the American people are saying more and more, we're disgusted with the political system. It's all about money. It's all about the reelection of these corrupt politicians. And
Right.
I think that the more we clarify how broken this is, the farther we're going to get. But of course, at substantive levels, we need a plan of action to decarbonize by 2050 that is not only at the state level, because many states have such plans taking shape, but at the federal level. Uh, and one of the main lessons of what's happening right now is that there are more projects in more projects in wind and solar
Yep.
than can be put onto the grid, because the real breakdown is the transmission system. But that's where federal investment and a federal plan is needed. And we don't have that because of all the political problems that I talked about.
And I think that America's structure is so like money based, money focused that it comes before the mutual benefits that all the human can get. It's
That's
always
exactly right.
yeah, it's
It's
always
it,
yeah.
it's not based on the common good. It's based on the special interest.
Right, it's always money, money, money. And then I want to touch on this is that we all know that Japanese is going to have a nuclear wastewater dumps. So what are some actions that United Nations would do to counter this type of behavior?
Well, on the specifics on Japan, I can't really comment because I haven't studied the scientific arguments on both sides. And in general, on technical arguments, I tend to listen to the range of experts and ask their opinion. So I would think at a minimum what the UN should be doing, and maybe it is, and I'm just not involved at all in it, is looking at through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is based in Vienna, at this question of the wastewater from Fukushima and what should be done about it, because that's a technical issue that should not be any individual government's authority. The UN should weigh in, especially at the technical level. But in general, we have some pretty clear needs that are urgent, whether it's the decarbonization or protecting the ecosystems from pollution or from over harvesting or from waste. And we need technical plans of action. But that planning mechanism is hard work. Uh, and it's hard work for the political reason of keeping it free from corruption. And it's hard work at the technical level because a lot of technical issues are raised. And so countries need effective planning ministries. China has the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, which does a lot of the technical planning. And the United States doesn't have a planning
Right.
ministry. So we don't make plans because we don't have a ministry of planning or a ministry of economy or a planning agency. In the US lexicon, planning is a bad idea. But, for certain things, I am happy that planning is done within private businesses. But for other things, I want the planning to be done by government. And in every sphere of the economy, planning is essential. It's just that sometimes it's not a government function, sometimes it's a private sector function.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the United States government needs to go through a really big structural change. And in that, I think the driving forces are the Gen Z and Gen Alpha people coming up. But right now, I think we lack guidance. So what are some advices that you would guide, like some advices that you would give us to start with?
Well, that's a really very interesting and deep question because let me just say that our Constitution was drafted in 1787. Of course, it's had some amendments since then, but basically it's the same structure that was decided in 1787. And it's out of date. It doesn't have the substantive principles that are needed for the modern period, and it does not enable the strong planning or environmental protection or assurance of economic rights for the people. So it's really an out of date structure in many, many ways. At the same time, it has been uh, deeply damaged by corruption, by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think uh, the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the U.S. system because
Yeah.
otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And yeah, I think currently another problem with the US is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. Like the counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States. So
Excellent point. Basically, there are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States. Because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide. They want their benefits without saying, "You see, I run the government." So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually.
yeah.
And so it takes some effort, but as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University
Yep.
working together, discussing, and so forth. Somehow making such projects, both the economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather
Right.
than to really educate them.
Yeah. And the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future. And we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So, last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, Go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. Don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world. I tried to get a piece in the New York Times recently. They actually accepted it, then they rejected it. I was trying to explain that there were provocations to this war because they have used the word unprovoked about the Russian invasion 26 times by my count. They've done it in their editorials. They've done it in the New York Times columnist columns like Tom Friedman and others. And they've done it in the invited op-ed pieces. So I said to the editors, come on, could you run something that says that there was provocation? You know, just let me write a few hundred words to put it on the other side. And first the editor said, yeah, we'll accept that. I actually sent in a piece and he edited it. And then they said, no, we're not going to run this thing. So it's very hard right now to have a real discussion in the major mainstream, I'd say pro-Biden media. You know, I think the New York Times, if it was probably against the prevailing administration, would be more critical. I don't think it's just pure dumbing down. I think it's politics. They like Biden, so they don't want to say anything against the Biden administration. And if the Biden administration is part of this war effort, they don't want to talk about it. I think that's really what it is. It's just a kind of pure partisanship, so that they feel, oh, we don't want Trump back, so we're not going to say anything bad about Biden. So, and our readers, they must think, you know, aren't grown up enough to be able to discern any subtleties in this. It's bad, actually. It's very strange.
It is strange.
I'll tell you, you know, my own view. This is another issue. But I'm a pretty good observer and I talk to a lot of people. And my own view, you know, just to shift topics for a moment, is that the US blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And I explained why I thought so from the start. Then came along Seymour Hersh, who I have to admit is a hero of mine, lifetime hero, because I grew up as a young kid reading his accounts of Vietnam War atrocities and so forth. So I've always loved Seymour, but he gave a very detailed explanation of what happened, the timing, how it was done, and so forth. You know, the New York Times didn't even cover that, didn't even cover it to debunk it. And then there was this almost like a joke. I think it was a joke on the New York Times, actually. They got some, you know, somebody from the CIA or someplace or the White House told them it was some people in a yacht. You know, it was 6 people in a boat. That story lasted about 24 hours. I mean, it didn't even last 2 minutes in my view. I thought it was hilarious, not substantive. But the New York Times ran it with a straight face, but they wouldn't run Seymour Hersh's account and then discuss it. So they're not even covering the news and much less challenging a critical thought. And that,
yes, I would
that's
agree.
Pretty serious.
The New York Times, the Washington Post, and their coverage of what's happening in Ukraine have really assigned themselves to irrelevancy because they are Pentagon PR flacks who just repeat talking points. And there's no serious investigation into any aspect of this war. And that's why, you know, at Code Pink, we support alternative, non-corporate journalism. Please tell others. Code Pink Radio will tell you the truth. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's talk about China a little bit further.
Yeah.
China has come out with the 12-point peace proposal, which Biden immediately dismissed as, what did he say? He said it was irrational. Frankly, his response was irrational. Meanwhile, we've had actual Code Pink members have met with representatives of China in Washington, D.C. to thank the Chinese government for coming up with this peace plan and for playing a peacemaker's role. I mean, whatever people think about China and whatever criticisms they have, I think we have to be very clear that China, as you mentioned, has maybe one or two overseas bases. It's not a threat militarily, and it is trying to play the role of peacemaker, not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. Do you think that China, the global South, can make a difference here? I mean, because it's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Brazil, it's other countries too that are saying we need a ceasefire. We need it now because they know the security of not just Ukraine and Russia and the United States is at stake, but the security of the entire globe.
First, I think people should understand a basic fact about China. China has not engaged in one overseas war in the last 40 years, while the United States has been engaged in non-stop wars. We keep pointing our finger at China. Look at how militaristic. We vastly outspend China on the military. We have surrounded China with military bases. We've been engaged in constant wars. We are trying right now to break the Chinese economy. And then we point our finger like the G7 did in this recent meeting in just a kind of a hate-filled, ignorant session. Look at how evil China is. Look at how evil China is. It's so low level for anyone who really follows this. I was actually myself in China last month. I've been to China so many times over the last 40 years. We're in a propaganda field right now of anti-China propaganda that has no basis in reality. And we're trying to create an enemy there so we can crush China because they're daring to achieve economic development. So this is the starting point. Now, in terms of China's peace plan, it has one crucial point. And it says that a peace agreement should respect the security interests of all parties. What does that mean? That's code for don't expand NATO, because Russia, understandably, regards that as a direct security threat. To have NATO weapons on Russia's 1,900-kilometer border with Ukraine is not what Russia would like. Just like we would not be thrilled with Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada or any place else nearby. That's what Russia's trying to tell us. China gets it. China just uses very Confucian, if I could say, very nice, orderly words, respect the security interests of all parties. And that means to the United States, would you understand what Russia has been saying to the US since Russia was independent, December 1991? Don't enlarge NATO. And especially since 2008. My God, not to Georgia. Are you kidding? That's what they've been telling us. And China gets it. And that's why Biden immediately rejected it. Because this is a game. The game is Nuland's game to expand NATO to Ukraine.
You know, I think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and by the way, if I may just, if I may just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back a lot. And now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas, he was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then letting, as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it. Stop. Don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this: NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in 2019,
but just
Ukraine
to say,
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, would you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean Georgia, the country in the Caucasus. Where's that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. Will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military-industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly, Jeffrey Sachs, I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war, propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. The first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be. As Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend can be fatal. We are killing Ukraine. Literally, we're killing Ukrainians, but we're killing Ukraine. Think of how we loved Afghanistan, how we love South Vietnam. What do we do? Iraq. If you are the place where the U.S. is waging a proxy war, first of all, you will be physically destroyed. You will have mass outmigration of young people, of talented people, of people just trying to survive, for God's sake. You'll have your infrastructure destroyed. All of this, the Ukrainian economy is busted, and the Ukrainian population has shrunk tremendously because people have left the country. And so this is in no way helping Ukraine. This is just, I tried to tell the Ukrainians, I'm for you, I'm not against you. They kept thinking, oh, that's Putin propaganda. I said, no, listen, I go back to the Vietnam War in the United States, to Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when the U.S. grabs you in a proxy war. And this is what's happening right now to Ukraine. It's being tragically destroyed. And every time things don't work, our side ratchets up. And they keep ratcheting up. And sad to say, Obama knew in 2014, he got the main point. when he said and realized that Russia has what's called escalatory dominance. What that means is Russia can meet us and raise the bet. Because for Russia, this is existential. For us, it's another war. Okay, we're going to expand NATO here. We're going to expand NATO there. We're going to do whatever we want to do. For Russia, they view this as the essence of Russia's national security. They have 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. Obama realized this, said, I don't want to even start down this path. I don't know what this administration is doing. They have no plan. It's phony. And phony in the sense that they have no route to success, but they're in it up to their necks right now. Worse than that, for Ukraine, they're in it above their heads. They're drowning in this violence. We've got to stop the fighting because there is no military path to victory because Russia can escalate and can escalate to devastation. And we're told, oh, don't say that, don't mention nuclear weapons and so forth. You know what? Mention them. Understand.
Yes, and I think
I
think we should also mention, Jeffrey Sachs, that the United States has a nuclear posture review. The Biden administration says we will use nuclear weapons first if our allies' interests are threatened. So, who's going to use them first or will they be used? All of this is speculation, but it's frightening that we are escalating right now, training Ukrainians on F-16 fighter jets that could
after they said again
Russia.
And again that they wouldn't do it, they keep taking the next step. It's time for the Nuland administration really to step down so that we can have peace and have some sanity.
Because I think we've covered a lot of ground for ASEAN, and we've heard a lot of things that are very promising. And that's good because we need some optimism and some direction for how to overcome some of the big challenges right now. If we were to step back from our crises and look at some of the very fundamental trends in the world, we'd have a great deal of reason for optimism, in fact. The world economy and world society as a whole has become much better off than it was 100 years ago, without question. Life expectancy has risen remarkably. Income in the world, on average, is now $20,000 per person if measured at international prices, and about $12,000 per person if measured at market prices. And this is a huge rise of incomes and well-being and quality of diets, protection of healthcare coverage, and many, many other really fundamental parts of our material life. And what Dr. Zhao described for China, which is absolutely incredible, for 1.4 billion people over a period of 40 years, has been achieved not quite at that pace, but very broadly in many parts of the world. And the underlying reason for those improvements is that science, technology, know-how has advanced and continues to advance even at an accelerating rate. So our ability to address practical challenges is really unprecedented right now. Our wealth is unprecedented, and our know-how is unprecedented. This is really the fundamental reason for being very optimistic about what we can do and what we should do in the coming years. What we've learned, though, is that there are at least three fundamental problems with the way the world functions. And that's what brings us to this workshop and what brings us to the Sustainable Development Goals. The first is that with all that progress, there are billions of people that have been effectively left behind this progress, that are really struggling for a variety of reasons. People live in more remote areas or in very unfavorable geographies, or are part of minority groups that have been maltreated within societies, or half the population, women and girls, that traditionally were not part of the market economy, were part of the household economy, and have definitely seen progress, but facing a lot of social obstacles still today, which is why one of the Sustainable Development Goals is directed specifically at the issues of gender, SDG 5. So one of the three huge challenges is that we have a rich world and a lot of very poor and suffering people within that world. And that's just, I think for most of us, humanly unacceptable. And indeed, when the UN was established in 1948, all of the member states agreed that there should be basic standards of life for every person on the planet, because they're people on the planet, because they're human beings, and the world is productive enough to ensure the dignity of everybody. And that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And I regard us still trying to honor that declaration, which seems to me to be the basic point. So problem number one is the very uneven development, the fact that there is still today a significant part of the world that lives in really abject deprivation. And that's a first challenge. And I think it's ethically probably the number one challenge, because extreme deprivation in a world of plenty is absolutely destructive of all of our humanity if we don't solve that problem. So that's why SDG 1 is end extreme poverty. Straightforward. And SDG 2, the second highest priority, is end hunger, for heaven's sake. Of course, there are big challenges of how to do it, but I will say in a world of wealth and knowledge, this is definitely within reach. It's crazy, to my mind, that if the average income is $12,000 per capita, there are people living at a few $100s per capita, and the world just goes on as they suffer and die young and face terrible hardships. The second big challenge, the huge challenge, the puzzle that is even harder than the first one conceptually, is that we discovered about 50 years ago that the nature of our economic development, all that wealth that I just talked about, is environmentally destructive, because the much vaunted economic processes don't take care of their physical byproducts. And some of them were not understood till 50 or 100 years ago, like greenhouse gases and their effects on climate. That required a scientific breakthrough of a quite deep order to understand that. It came by the end of the 19th century, and then it took at least 75 years to create measurement systems to verify the science. And we've more or less known from around 1980 that humanity is really changing the climate in ways that could be dangerous. And we're still struggling with that fact, because what brought us that wealth in the first place, starting in the 1800s, was fossil fuels. And then we discovered about halfway through, oh, those are dangerous. That's not good. So this is the second big problem, is that we have an economic system and a set of laws, rules, regulations, a global commons, the open seas, and many other factors of our economic system that mean that the scale of production is now self-destructive. And as I say, we've understood this intellectually at least for about 50 years. It was 50 years ago that the first conference on this fact took hold. It was 51 years ago that the first good book about this, Limits to Growth, was written and made clear that there was a real problem. And we've not finished solving that problem. But let me stipulate the following, just like I did for the first one. There's nothing fundamental about these environmental challenges that is beyond our solution, even with our current knowledge base. In other words, we already in 2023 have the range of technical solutions to 90% of the greenhouse gases, not 100%. We definitely don't face a choice between food and nature. We face a choice between destructive and non-destructive forms of food production. That's a very different choice. I haven't found in 40 years of my work on this a fundamental barrier to economic well-being and environmental sustainability. So I'm not in the degrowth school of thought, which says that what we really need is to reverse economic development. Not all economic development is good for human well-being. That's a different matter. But I'm not of the school of thought that says we've created a kind of society that is completely inconsistent with our environmental necessities or our environmental well-being or health. What we have is a very flawed economic system, legal system, regulatory system, incentive structure, so that we adopt or continue with technologies that are very ill-advised and do lots of stupid things because it's possible to make money off of those stupid things rather than do the things that we should be doing. And I've not seen in all of my experience any calculations that show me that doing the right things is beyond our reach, beyond our budget, beyond our economic means. For example, all of the estimates about the energy transformation to a zero carbon energy system suggest that it's 1 or 2% of world output that is needed to make that change. That's really strange. It's not that it's 50% of world output that's needed. It's not that this is cataclysmically expensive and we're just doomed as if an asteroid were coming to hit the planet and we have nothing to do. No, we have clear, very, very clear things to do. Sometimes we have too many possible things to do, so we don't know which one to take, so we're paralyzed. Should we do wind or solar or nuclear or this? I don't know. We won't do anything right now. We're making money with what we're doing. So we're paralyzed, or we know what to do, but there are strong vested interests saying don't do it because I'm making too much money in the short term doing the destructive things. Or it just is complicated and hasn't been thought out properly, because this is something absolutely new. It was rather straightforward to build a coal plant, but it's not so straightforward, perhaps, to build offshore wind or solar fields or something else because of storage or other issues. So there are just complexities. But that's the second big category of challenge that we face, which is this economic environmental collision course, which again needs analysis and then needs to ask, how deep is the problem? And for me, and how solvable is the problem? So the climate crisis is very deep, but it's also rather solvable. And there are some puzzles, definitely. What should big ocean tankers run on? Should it be hydrogen fuel cells? Should it be ammonia? Should it be hydrogen combustion? I'm not an engineer. I've heard the arguments from the engineers. I want them to fight it out. I want them to try different approaches, but clearly we should be trying these technology lines. The third big challenge, which is a challenge of time immemorial, is that we seem to have a very hard time to stop killing each other. So war becomes ever more dangerous because the weapons become ever more destructive. And now we're technologically so smart that we figured out how to destroy the whole humanity. Damn it. If we weren't so smart, we wouldn't have this trouble. But a few geniuses figured out you could make nuclear fission work to make a bomb. By the way, there were probably 50 people in the world that understood that. And they figured it out, and then they gave it to a world of idiots. So we have a lot of dumb people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, and they were made by a few geniuses. That's our problem. So this is our third issue, which is how to stay peaceful and cooperative. To my mind, these are the three big issues that we face, which is how to be fair and decent to people who are suffering, how to make sure that we're not self-destructive because our economic system is actually a complicated set of incentives that doesn't get things right. And there's no magic in how we have organized our economic life to handle issues like greenhouse gases, which weren't in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and are not part of the things that a free market can solve, and so forth. And the third is this interminable problem that if you read human history, we've been fighting with each other most of the time. But there are also glimmers of hope that there are long periods of peace, and we also have institutions for peace, just like we have institutions for war. One of the things that makes me quite optimistic about China's rise is that China has been much more peaceful in its history than just about any other region of the world. And the amount of interstate war of China over the last 2,000 years is actually quite low. It's basically been wars of pastoralists coming from the north and sedentary farmers trying to fight them off. And that's been most of China's wars for 2,000 years. If you look at Europe's wars, it was just kill each other across the divide for 1,000 years, nonstop. So China at least has a peaceful tradition, and I think it fits actually with this idea of harmonious society, with the idea of global civilizations and so forth. I'm quite an optimist, I have to say, about that, because I think it actually there's a deep rootedness. So that's all we have to do. End poverty, protect the environment, stop killing with each other. All right? So, thank you. No, okay. So what do we do? To my mind, the basic thing is we should think hard about each of those things and then come up with plans. That's the most basic idea. That sounds so dumb. Why am I saying that after 40 years? Don't I have anything more intelligent to say? And the thing is that the way that our social systems work is not to think and then solve these things. And that's very interesting. Our economic system is designed around a different principle, which is let people do what they want, get rich, go find your job, go buy what you want, but not solve problems. So in economic land, it's not oriented towards solving problems. It's oriented towards doing your thing. Businesses are supposed to go make profits, and we're supposed to be good consumers, and we're supposed to be smart in the job that we pursue. But at least in market economics, which became the dominant ideology of the Anglo-Saxon world and then the world, it isn't to solve problems, it's go do your thing. So don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the economic sphere or from the business community. It's not their job. Their job is to run a business. It's to make money. So that's problem number one, that we don't think in the economic sphere about end goals. We're supposed to just do our thing. And then politicians. In most politics, it's not about solving problems. It's about maintaining power. And that's even the goal. And you have experts on maintaining power. All the politicians have little Machiavellis around them, handing them, this is what you need to do to stay in power. And that's your goal. And so politics, at least in my country, has very little to do with any goals. I don't know what any American goals are. We have no goals. We have some heroes, our founding fathers. We love the Constitution. We like the July 4th Independence Day, but we have no goals. And even when I hear Dr. Zhao talk about China's goals, you could not have that in the United States, stating those goals, because that's socialism. You're not allowed to have goals. So politics is not oriented towards solving problems. Really, it's management of power, competition for power, holding on to power, benefiting from power. And so we don't see from our governments most of the time these big goals and how to solve them. I really think China's been different in this period, the last 40 years, from most other governments. And I think the success is a result of that, actually, that it's really, and why? Well, I think this is a very interesting question, but a few countries at a few times have very clear goals, maybe because of survival, maybe because of their past history, maybe because they have a successful neighbor, so they want to imitate the success, maybe like in Singapore, because a genius came, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had a very, very clear idea. And really, Singapore, it is a case of a very clear, brilliant thinker who just guided things for quite a while, like Plato's philosopher king. But most of the time, this is not how politics is. So we don't see a lot of this problem solving coming from governments. And the third thing is, in my country, which became the most powerful country in the world for the last 75 years militarily, they really think that fighting wars is a big part of what governance is about. They're crazy and dangerous and could get us all killed. So that third category of just peaceful cooperation does not come easily. Every day we read something hateful about China in the American newspapers now. Every single day. I just read today, China has the Global Civilizations Initiative. Wonderful. You talked about it. Today I just read, this is terrible. This is, China's out to take over the world through this. Now, honestly, this is a mindset that is very, very deep, probably ingrained evolutionarily in us also, because there probably was a time when whoever could control the next water hole survived, and whoever didn't survive, and it was us or them. And that's not how the world is right now. It's not us or them. We don't need to take over any other place to have well-being, period. There's no crisis of living room. There is only the crisis of understanding, don't kill the other side. Okay, so what do we do? Again, just to conclude, we need to think clearly. Excuse me. That's a technical term about American politics. So we need really to put serious ideas forward in detail. And that's the purpose of what we're after. And two specific pathways that we're really focusing on right now is one is the energy transition, because there's only a quarter century and an energy system's really complicated. You have to have a power grid. We have to convert all the vehicles to electric or to hydrogen or to some other non-emitting source. The building sector has to be far more efficient. Industry emits a lot of greenhouse gases. Deforestation. In other words, all of the getting to net zero is quite a complicated challenge with lots of moving parts, and it's a lot of money. Not more than an energy system costs, but an energy system is trillions of dollars a year, and so it's worth getting right. So that's the first of the pathways. And the second is the land use and ocean use, because we're really so close to destroying everything irreversibly. When the species is lost, it's never coming back. And when the ecosystems are degraded, many of them never return. And if we pass climate thresholds, we're just going to spend the next century in disaster of calamitous sea level rises, storms, heat waves, and so on. So we're very close to that. So those are the two main pathways that we are really focusing on: the biological and its association with food production and with other agricultural production. And for this region, that's central, because this is a biodiversity Garden of Eden, and also a biodiversity threatened region intensively. All this beauty, and it's being torn down. And it can happen so fast because economies are very, very large right now, and demands. China could deforest this country just by its demands for tropical hardwoods without a problem, unless you take care. So those are the two areas that we really want to focus on. And the final point that I want to say is, again, about this third category of cooperation. It happens that when you look technically at an energy program or at a ecosystem program, no country can do this by itself. Nothing can be done other than at the local level, but plans need to be transnational without question. So there's a lot of local action, but they have to be part of a broader framework. And that's why this is an ASEAN workshop, because ASEAN countries are not only together on the map and not only physical neighbors, but have work to do together, because ASEAN countries cannot achieve their goals without working together. And so we need to do this at a transnational planning level. That's hard because there are no elected transnational officials anywhere. All transnational organizations are weak because none of them has an army. None of them has political leaders. We're organized at the national level in the world. That's where the physical force lies. And that's where the politics generally lies. And yet we have global and regional problems that need addressing urgently. The Mekong is not going to be saved one country at a time. It's going to be saved by China, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam working together. Without question, there's no way to do that one country at a time. It's got to be done in the watershed. The energy system for Malaysia absolutely needs to be integrated with the rest of the region. And those regional institutions are weak politically and organizationally, and they need to be strengthened considerably. And then the question of what region is the right region for this. We're dealing with ASEAN because it's a crucial, established regional entity. But I said yesterday, and I'll say it again, I think for the energy sector, RCEP is even more appropriate. That's adding in ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The United States would have a fit, by the way. I'll be done in 1 minute. The US would have a fit. You're cooperating with China? Well, my strong advice to you is cooperate with China closely. And my strong advice to Australia is don't build a submarine base, cooperate with China. And let's not waste money on nuclear submarines right now and raise the tension more. So my own advice is that broader group, and I hope India joins that group, and then we've got a lot of the world together in a way that could actually solve the problems. So sorry for the long rambling, except I believe that all of these problems are solvable. I believe that universities have a unique and extremely important role to play in this, because this is what we should be doing. Training, teaching, educating, researching, policy analysis, and really trying to make politics work the way that it should, which is for the common good. Thank you. I want to talk about the big picture, which Ned always bids us to do, and that means the world. And
why I believe that we're at a time of a fundamental change of politics. And by politics, I mean all dimensions of collective action. In economics, of course, politics is essentially about meeting public goods. Public goods change over time because of changes in the human condition, in technology, in scale, in the nature of the challenges. Today's challenges are global and regional, and by regional I mean international at a scale typically of a continent. We grew up in the era of the nation state. The nation is no longer a good definition of where the main public goods lie for most purposes, and so we're moving, I think, away from a nation state system to a more complex system of governance. But it's not easy because every institution, such as the UN at the global level, or the EU at the regional level, or ASEAN, is basically still driven by the nation state. That's where the power, the taxation, and the armies are. And so the nation states won't give up their prerogatives easily, though they are the wrong level of aggregation to solve the problems that we have. So a great deal of our global problems are that we're trying to solve global and regional problems or local problems with nation states. That is a legacy of the Western European system. It's anachronistic. We're not over it yet, but things are changing very quickly. So what are some key characteristics of the current era? First, the most important fundamental characteristic is an economic convergence between the North Atlantic region, which led the world economy for the last 250 years, and the rest of the world. Not all of the rest of the world, to be sure, but even the lagging parts of the world, most notably Africa, I believe will have a very rapid catching up in the next decades. So I think convergence is the dominant feature of the world economic scene. This is creating multipolar geopolitics. Though be nice when you go to Washington, just whisper that, don't say it loudly. Washington still believes that it's a unipolar world. It is delusional. It's creating wars and conflict, but we are in a multipolar world, whether Washington likes it or not. Of course, we're in an era of hyper-rapid technological change, the fastest in history, because we now have machines that make the change for us as well, and we have an acceleration of technological change. All technological pessimism, I think, is a mistake. We have no shortage of technological breakthroughs. Of course, how we use the technologies is quite another matter. Is it AI for drones, or is it AI to solve problems? And we're not quite clear on that. We have, of course, profound environmental crises that are deep, real, intensifying, and at an urgent stage. We're already in the acute phase of human-induced climate change, destruction of biodiversity, massive pollution, which claims many millions of lives per year. We're already in the acute phase. These are all public human-induced climate change, destruction of biodiversity, massive pollution, which we hear wisdom someplace. Thank you. These all require public goods of a new kind at a global, regional, biome, ecosystem scale. And of course, we're grappling with creating that, and we're not succeeding now 51 years after the first conference on environment and economy in Stockholm. We have rapid demographic change, not all bad. The world population is going to stabilize and start to decline in the 21st century. That's a good thing. We're completing the demographic transition, an aging economy, an urban world economy, a significant rise of Africa's share in the world economy to perhaps 1/4 or even 1/3 of the world population by later in this century. And we now, as I'm emphasizing, have public goods at regional, by that I mean transnational, and global scale to an extent that is unprecedented. And that requires a different kind of governance. So we have outgrown the nation state. We need political subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the concept that we don't have competing polities at different levels. We have a kind of concentric circle of politics where global problems get solved globally, regional problems get addressed regionally, national problems get addressed nationally, local problems get addressed locally, with the basic dictum, go as local as possible, consistent with the problem. And I think that this is the right idea about public goods. US hegemony is a chimera, very dangerous right now because everybody knows it except the United States. And so the US is actually provoking a lot of war and tension and conflict right now as it struggles to come to grips with its limited power. And fourth, we're going to need an ethical basis for the global and regional public goods, because all of economic life depends on an ethical formation, shared precepts, implicit or explicit, and this now has to happen at a global level, and I'll give a few thoughts to that very quickly. I wrote a bit about this in a book in 2020 called The Ages of Globalization, and my main theme was that to understand global scale change, we need to understand the interplay of physical geography, technological change, and institutional change. And all three are paramount in our own age. And of course, as a materialist as I am, I believe that human history has essentially been paced by technological breakthroughs and essentially in energy, food, transport, and data. Data defined broadly to include computation, transmission, storage of information. And the major eras of human change are eras of breakthrough. Fire was the first era that enabled us to have larger brains, so the encephalization came with the harnessing of fire, the harnessing of agriculture, the domestication of the horse, the discovery of how to mobilize wind and water power already 2.5 to 3 millennia ago. Of course, the breakthrough with fossil fuel, with the steam engine in the 18th century, with the electric dynamo in the 19th century, nuclear age, and so forth. So all of this is to say we are very much paced by large technological changes. The dominant technological changes of our day came out of the wonderful imagination of Alan Turing and John von Neumann and the architects of the digital world with the transistors and integrated circuits, and this is a deep transformation that is propelling us today. So in good classical Enlightenment form, I approach this as a stadial theory of change, meaning you make stages. I designate 7 stages. I won't go through them in this brief period, but each is paced by major technological change, which gives rise to political change. It creates city-states, or nations, or empires, or transoceanic empires. And we are in another phase of fundamental political change. So just a word about the geography of long-term development. An unbelievable amount of economic development takes place between these narrow latitudes because they are favored with the lucky fortune of a band of east-west geography of temperate and semi-arid zone steppelands and temperate agriculture, which encompassed typically 70 or 80% of the world population, and almost all of the technological changes in history, and the major empires line up incredibly along this line throughout history. So in most of human history, Asia was, from as far back as we know it, the most populated part of the world, 65 to 70% of world population. China and India have been giants in population for 2 millennia at least. And for most of that time, per capita income didn't vary so much, as we know, and I'm using Angus Madison's famous estimates here. It meant that the shares of output more or less tracked the shares of population, with the modest variation for different periods, like the Song Dynasty being a particularly prosperous period in China, for example. But aside from the ups and downs, Asia was the center of gravity of the world system. Then, of course, this began to change very gradually after the beginning of the 16th century in the so-called Age of Discovery or Age of Conquest, and it really took off after the end of the 18th century because of the steam engine, fundamentally, the era of industrialization. And since that came to England first, England used that to conquer much of the world. Just to say, as everybody knows, it is the great accident of history that Europe became the first to industrialize and to conquer Asia, because it was absolutely far more likely, I'd say something like 10-1 in favor of China in the 15th century, that it would go the other way. China was very close to discovering the sea routes to Europe and even possibly to the Americas across the northern Pacific. But in 1434, the single worst economic policy mistake in human history was made when the mandarins at the Ming court scrapped the Chinese fleet and just ended what was the mega age of discovery and oceanic transport of the giant fleets of Admiral Zheng He. Absolutely no deep reason for it. It was a catastrophic mistake. The next time the sea routes were opened between Europe and Asia was Europeans going to conquer Asia, not Asians going to explore and trade with Europe. So Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And my favorite lines from The Wealth of Nations, which is a remarkably wonderful and humane book, as well as a brilliant treatise. But my favorite part is this. Adam Smith says, the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope, that's 1498 and 1492, are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Big statement, not bad. Connecting the whole world by these two oceanic voyages. Their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, because Smith is writing in 1776, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says, because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, hereafter, perhaps the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead in the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. The steam engine, a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire. But it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine. And there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, you have to import our opium. No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you. That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the second Opium War. No scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization. And it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff, and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Genghis Khan. It was captivating to Lord Palmerston. And it has been captivating to American leaders since then also to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat. Teutoburg Forest was the lost by Augustus Octavian in AD 9 when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire. It just told them this is a limit and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now, but it's a secret. Don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So the world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet, but this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era. And the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths, again, using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track, nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know as our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule, Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read, because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation. And so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was, what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb, and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. And that is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year, and I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because we are zoon politikon. We are political animals. We can be sociable. And so I think finding this commonality of East and West is crucial now, because there actually is a strong commonality of the underlying cultures. This was already pointed out in the observations of the axial age, that these philosophies arose roughly the same time and with roughly the same philosophical underpinnings. And I'll just end with President Kennedy's remarks 60 years ago. We're at the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's remarkable initiative to make peace at the height of the Cold War and to negotiate the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which was ratified just these days 60 years ago. Kennedy may well have been killed for it because rogue elements of the US government hated him for his peace initiatives, and I believe that this is probably what did him in. But he made wonderful observations about peace, and I'll just end with his most beautiful words. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.